Welcome, everyone. My name's Colin from Chef. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker. As I'm sure you heard today from our founder, Adam Jacob, community is a huge part of Chef. And one of the most important parts of our community is a group called the Sous Chefs. And today we have Joe Holston from the Sous Chefs, who's going to tell us about cookbook maintenance and a variety of other things. So join me in welcoming Joseph.
Thanks, Colin. So this is the hard way, and we're here to talk about sous chefs and an impressively large number of painful things that we've experienced over the last couple of years, and how you can avoid them for yourself so you don't have to learn them the hard way. So I'm Joseph Holston. I'm a member of Sous Chefs, and I wanted to get a show of hands before we got much further. Who in here has used a Chef Infra cookbook before? Great. And who's used a community cookbook? Who's found a bug in a community cookbook they thought was going to work? And who's gone and tried to file a bug for the issue and discovered that the cookbook was no longer maintained? Okay, great. That is what Sous Chefs exists to fight. So we want to make sure that that never happens again. We're a collaborative community that works together to maintain cookbooks. Sometimes going so far as tracking down the owners of important unmaintained cookbooks and bring some new life to them. Bring new life to the cookbooks, not to the owners. They're usually fine. So even if you haven't heard of us before, that's fine. You probably have a dependency on one of our cookbooks. But if you haven't heard of us, that means that we're doing our job really well. And I want to make sure that you're in the right place. So if you are at all like me, you might be a little bit lazy and want to avoid reinventing the wheel and duplicating work. Or maybe you're a bit angry because you've hit a bug and you're frustrated because you thought it was going to work. Or maybe you're impatient because there's already a fix for this thing, but nobody's gotten around to actually releasing it. Or maybe you're oddly chipper and want to contribute to open source because you have boundless energy and are a beacon of light in the universe. That's possible, I guess. So we've been there in Sous Chefs. We've been there again and again for years, and we've dealt with these issues. In fact, we've dealt with these issues and thought that we dealt with these issues and then discovered that we didn't quite deal with these issues as well as we thought we did. And I want to be clear, the goal here today is to talk about the pain points that we've hit repeatedly and talk about some of the tools that we've used to make our experience better. And I also want to be painfully clear that I write very little code in Sous Chefs these days. Most of what I'm talking about has been done by community members who aren't able to make it to ChefConf and they aren't often recognized. There's hundreds of people who have contributed to these cookbooks over the years, and I've gone through a frightening number of their commits and tried to find all of the awesome stuff that's in them to share them with you today. I had to cut a bunch, but I hope we've got some gold in here. So we're going to be talking about a number of patterns. To begin with, we're going to be talking about documentation, your user's first experience with the cookbooks, the interface that those users are going to be interacting with your cookbook over. We're going to be talking about the underlying implementation, some patterns around testing to make sure that you thought it was going to work a certain way and now does it actually, and releasing those cookbooks so that way the public can actually use them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the first line of support for your work is documentation. It's the written word that new users and experienced hands alike come to when they want to use your work in your cookbooks. But of course, new users and experienced have different needs. And so we need to talk about getting started guides, quick start examples, reference documentation, as well as, once you've gotten through those, how it changes over time and what tools you need to maintain them properly. So the first thing that most users will experience, they'll come to your cookbook and they'll see some sort of a getting started guide. And that getting started guide may just be from a cookbook generator that's telling you to stick your default recipe in, or it might be ridiculously large, having out-of-date tutorials and reference documentation for lots of resources that don't actually reflect what the cookbook is, plus talking about prerequisites and common hang-ups and licensing and maintainers that have never been part of this organization in the last few years. Unfortunately, new users don't care about that stuff. New users want to know generally what they can expect from your cookbook. And they want to know where to find the answers to the rest of their questions. And they don't want to have to wade through an entire encyclopedia just to get there. So what we've been doing is we've been slimming down our READMEs, not taking the everything belongs in the README approach, and making sure that it's the signpost to all of the reference information that they're going to want, but that they can start using the cookbook as soon as possible by just reading the README. But one thing that's important, we don't generate READMEs. We don't generate this kind of documentation because it's part of their user experience. People like to say it's a sort of thing that should be curated. You want to make sure that you're doing this stuff by hand. And you'll notice that some things that we talk about today, you might consider automating them, and I'll talk about it if we don't do that. Because there are things that should be automated, and it's fun to have slides that say automate everything. But sometimes making sure that you've got a human touch is actually worth it. So the next thing that your new users are often going to want is a quick start example. They're going to want a thing they can copy and paste and run and see how this thing works, and then tweak it to make it suit their needs. And this is important for experienced users too, because they often want to have a basis. Maybe they're hitting a weird bug and they want to know, wait, what does the simple case look like? How do I make sure that my complicated thing is actually what's causing the problem? But I don't know if you've ever experienced this. A lot of the time when you see these quick start examples in documentation, they're stale. They have bugs in them. They don't work properly. They're not up to date. I just said the same thing a number of times in a row. It's okay, but we can do better than that. We've moved to pointing our users towards our integration tests and treating our integration tests as the examples that they really should be. So the remedy is to have your systems actually running tests on your quick start examples and making sure that the changes that you do in the future are consistent and play nicely with the use cases that your users actually want to do. So okay, you've gotten through a getting started guide, you've copied and pasted this quick start example into your text editor and run it, and you've got the basic thing. But now you need to do something more complicated. You need to dive into an existing cookbook and figure out why it's being so weird. It's not acting the way that you need. You need reference documentation. You need resource documentation. And it's very common to see people stick thousands of pages, it feels like, into a README, and you can't find your way around in them. Instead, we've been moving these out into their own individual files, so that way we can put context around how they should be used and how they interact with one another when you do it in a single README, the narrative feels strained when you've got to reference, hey, you should use this with that other kind of resource, and this is what the experience should feel like. If you have each of them in their own individual place, people can look at them in that small context and get the whole thing into their head at once. Now, while the previous examples weren't, we recommend you don't generate them, this is a situation where I suspect we could get to a place where generation would make sense. But we actually don't know any decent tools for doing this right now. We've played with some, but they're not as flexible as we want them to be. So if you find a good tool for this, we would definitely be interested in knowing about it. So you've got people through their getting started guide, their quick start example. They've started doing some complicated things that require digging into the reference documentation. But 6 months later, you've released a new version of your cookbook, and it's got some changes that will affect your users. The standard tool is a changelog, but the pain point that we've seen a whole lot is people just dump their commit messages into their changelog and act like that's useful in any way. It usually isn't, because the commit messages that are valuable to determining if a commit is correct and should be merged are not the same as what a user cares about and how it will affect their environment. So instead, we use the keep a changelog format that it's markdown based, and it has a set of style guides that you can follow to be consistent with lots of other projects that are out there, but it's hand curated. And you can include links to the particular PRs. You can include links to the commit messages, which is what we do, so that way your users can find the details if they need them, but otherwise they only have to read the changes that they care about. Once you've gotten all this documentation, of course, you're going to start getting drift. You've got multiple authors, and there's going to be a bunch of divergence between how they write things. So it's worth investing in a little bit of tooling to make sure that your style guide can be automated. We happen to like Markdown Lint, and it's caught a bunch of things that I would not have suspected. If you guys are doing Markdown for your documentation, investigate some automation on it. So okay, we've documented how this thing works, right? But we actually haven't talked about making the cookbook work. So there's a bunch of potential pain in there. But before we go further, I want to be clear, sometimes the pain can't just be remedied by a simple trick. Sometimes to fully remedy things, we've had to fully rewrite a cookbook. And at first that sounds like we're saying that it was in a place that was so bad that we had to throw away everything just to get something useful. But that's not really the case. In fact, most of our cookbooks that we adopt come to us in perfectly usable shape, but they're opinionated about how they should be used, and they're application cookbooks, but they're installing and configuring and running their applications in a relatively fixed way, not flexible at all. And we've discovered that when people come to our cookbooks and we've solved like 80% of their problem, they still need to make a few tweaks to make it work in their environment. But every time we keep adding more tweaks, more node attributes and more flags to add more features, the cookbook will get more brittle. And the simple use cases suddenly become much more complicated. So we've discovered that if we break apart our app cookbooks into common components, people can reuse a lot more of the cookbooks. The custom parts that they actually need to work in their environment and then just fit in between. What's better, if they need to rewrite a part of a cookbook, they can copy a much smaller piece, change it to make it meet their needs, and reuse the rest of the community cookbook. That keeps their maintenance duties a lot smaller. So let's talk about some of the patterns for the chunks that we pull out. The most bang for the buck tends to come from extracting resources out of recipes. And you've probably heard plenty of talks about this. This is going to be a bit high level. There's definitely good deep dives into how structurally to do this, but I'm going to talk about the problems that we're trying to solve, the ones that we see again and again. So the first thing are config resources. If you're running an application, you're configuring an application. And oftentimes there's logic around it, there's getting parameters passed over to the template, there's validation, there's defaults, there's combining attributes to have higher order effects, which can be very painful when you've got all of that logic intertwinkled into your recipes. So what we've done is we extract the underlying template resource, but we also pull along the validation, the default values, the interactions between the attributes and forming and so on. And that allows us to have all of that logic be in one place and really clean up a cookbook. But sometimes we also have to have different classes of config resources. So for example, with Apache, you've got your main server configuration, but you also have site configuration. So it's worth having sometimes different config resources to represent different kind of templating that you do. Another thing that we find very often is people want to install things their own way. Maybe you're in an environment where you've got a local package repo and everything must be coming through there, or maybe you use, say, Refactoring and everything must be installed through artifacts that are downloaded from that system. Or maybe you really trust your vendor, but you are using a weird fork and aren't just trusting what's in your operating system initially. Well, our cookbook isn't going to support that by default. So what we're doing is we're encapsulating the installation method so it's got reasonable defaults. Maybe a system that pulls from the application vendor, and maybe a system that pulls from an operating system packaging, and we don't try and provide anything else. If you end up needing to do something different, you copy your default recipe into your application cookbook, remove this, and place in your local strategy, and you can keep using our resources as if that was how it was meant to be used. Similarly, this was much more the case in the past, but service resources can be different between different organizations as well. Some people are very opinionated about their process management. Some people really dislike systemd. I'm sure you've never met any of those people. But we've discovered that in most cases, systemd is fine. And so we will encapsulate running a service with systemd, and it works on the platforms that we support. But we're not going to also support Runit and Bluepill and 6 different other systems. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to. So by extracting the service resource, we enable you to rip out that component and manage your piece the way that you want to. So okay, we've extracted all of these common components into resources, and everything is magically better. But you'll notice when you do that, that a lot of the values are probably coming in from node attributes. And those have a pain all their own. For example, oftentimes people will use node attributes to do platform selection for, I don't know, a run directory or a temp directory or some system-wide thing. And that will give a user the mistaken impression that that's a variable that they should tune, when it is not. The problem with using node attributes is they expose a lot of the internals to the users and make it much more complicated. We've discovered that by extracting that sort of thing into helper methods, we can make them testable, we can make them well encapsulated, we can document them, all of which are things that very rarely happen when it comes to node attributes. Now I should also mention both node attributes and this sort of helper method are in the global namespace, so you should be treating them like they're globals with all the dangers that entails. We try not to do global things from inside the resources that we're extracting, because we want those to be only accessed in the global state, basically in the top level recipes. That makes things much easier to reason about and test cleanly. So okay, we've talked about this beautiful interface that you're now moving your cookbook to, and your users are going to be able to use whatever installation method works in the division of your company, or they can use this service running system that they're most comfortable with. But under the hood, you still got to implement it, right? So what does that look like? You're starting with an inflexible recipe, and you want to turn it into a library cookbook with a skinny application recipe, there's a bunch of patterns that you probably want to do to keep from hurting yourself while you're doing it. First of all, enforcing cookbook best practices and standardizing your build steps will make things a heck of a lot easier and save you a bunch of time in the long run. Then you want to talk about making sure you're not using any undocumented system calls or unmaintained helper libraries. And when you do find common patterns, you try and refactor to those, like the accumulator pattern. Let's talk about best practices for a minute. If you are maintaining 20 cookbooks, then you're probably going to start noticing some drift between the first cookbook you wrote and the 20th one, and then when you come back to modify that thing 6 months later. The best way we found to at least make everything more readable is to use things like Food Critic and Cookstyle, which is a Rubocop profile, to keep everything unified. Now, it's not a magic bullet, but it's really easy to run these things, and it's worth investing in getting your own preferences codified so you can just run these on every check-in and unify your standards. Which brings us to having standardized files. If you've got 20 cookbooks, you've got 20 different build server configs, you've got 20 different potentially lint configs, you've got a lot of different things that could start being divergent. It's worth investing in tooling to make sure that each of those files is the same in every repo. Now, if that just means that once a month you go through and roll a for loop to update the command in every repo, that's gotten us very far. But you should at least invest in making sure that you've got standardized stuff, or else you're going to start having cookbooks where one of them has, say, linting enabled, and another only runs integration tests. And your developers are going to start wondering why something got into production when it wasn't properly tested because they had mistaken expectations. So once you've got everyone on the same baseline, you can start actually making improvements. And one of the things that will get you some improvements is removing stuff you don't need. Removing support for old platforms, because I don't know about your developers, but no developer I've ever met ever tests their stuff on a platform they didn't develop on. So if you've got to support, say, 6 different distros, you only got testing on one of them when they committed it. And it's great to depend on automated testing, but it will only get you so far. The newer distros are actually much more similar, so it will also save you a bunch of time. You also want to pay attention to unmaintained dependencies. We happen to have a number of cookbooks that depended on a project called Poise that used undocumented APIs that are basically a time bomb, because at some point a new version of Chef is going to come out and break that tool. And unfortunately, the maintainer is no longer putting time into that anymore, so we need to move away from it. Similarly, in the opposite direction, you want to move towards common patterns that can make you have more powerful cookbooks. So for example, the accumulator pattern is a pattern you may see documented in a few different blog posts about how you can have multiple resources that all end up touching the same thing. So for example, multiple config segments that all get written to the same config file. That's worth looking up. I believe DN Simple has a good blog post about it. So okay, we've talked about what it looks like for the new users. We've talked about the interface and how to actually implement it. So what goes into testing this stuff, right? We've got a bunch of change. Well, the thing that's helped us test the most is updating our build server. We had a whole bunch of trouble with it. And if you are not getting as much testing, as much automation as you would like, you should definitely see if there are things you can change about your build server. We had overloaded build servers that meant tests would take a very long to present feedback. We had transient errors, like issues with our package mirrors, and we had a bunch of duplication in between our config files because there was no higher order configuration that we could use to make this stuff efficient. So we switched from Travis CI to Circle CI because it's got solutions to all of those things. And of course, their solution to having overloaded build servers is taking our money and giving us bigger build servers, but at least we had the option of solving it. The other thing that's really nice about Circle CI is we get to standardize our build. We get to use a thing called Orbs, which is just a plugin that lets us use a standard set of scripts for every cookbook. So if you're wondering how we managed to have support for Chef 15 before Chef 15 even came out, That's because some of our contributors put testing for Chef Latest into our orbs, and we were testing for it before it was even released. Now, standardizing your build server is not quite the same as standardizing your testing. And I'm not going to talk about testing. I hear there's going to be a good talk about testing a little bit later this afternoon. But we've had a whole lot of luck at moving our testing to the same set of tools, so we're not having to relearn tools in every different cookbook. So we've been using ChefSpec for helpers and resources. When you use helpers and resources, you can actually get some testing out of ChefSpec, which is much more difficult if you're doing everything in recipes. Similarly, for our examples, we are using Kitchen and InSpec. Now, as an aside, we're using kitchen-dokken as our runner inside to do our integration tests, and that makes things a lot easier. Now, it's not the most powerful thing. There are certain edge cases we can't support. SE Linux is a thing that isn't going to play nicely inside of a Docker container. But if you're interested in having a lightweight runner, it's worked really well for us. So we've got everything documented, designed, implemented, tested. It's ready to release, right? So we just need to deploy it. Our pain point here, though, tends to be that we need a responsible human being who should gate the release process. Okay, that's actually not a pain point. That's a feature. I brought this up because this gating is always manual, and we don't want to just have random people releasing our cookbooks. In fact, our process right now is to have a maintainer manually tag and publish a cookbook using Git and Stove. And we'd like to have it automated, but we haven't found a way to securely do that and also allow random strangers to access our build server and with the PRs that they push us. So if you find something like that, we would love to know how to do that safely. So now that you've released your cookbook, you get to enjoy the most delightful of pain points, other people. So the first thing you want to deal with when they're responding to your newly updated cookbook, because I'm sure they're all extremely delighted and none of them are frustrated in any way, is you need to document what their expectations should be. And GitHub has great support for documenting a code of conduct and a contributing document, which you should absolutely have. And we can also do issue templates and pull request templates, which make it easier for those folks. Additionally, they support a thing called a .github repository, which allows you to just create these once and have it be the same for your entire organization. Another thing that's really useful is once you've defined what those issue standards are in your issue template, being able to check if people actually followed those, because maybe you want people to label their issues, or you want them to actually, I don't know, describe the pull request that they just sent you. Danger is a tool that can actually run those tests and raise an alert, give a helpful warning message to a contributor who's not doing things the way that you want them to do. You'd think that unit testing frameworks would be able to do this, but they usually can't because they don't have any context around the actual PR, just around the code. So another pattern we've moved to is always be closing. We get a lot of issues, and sometimes the issues go unanswered because a maintainer doesn't think they're the right person to answer the question, or they need a day to think about it because they're not quite sure what to say. But this leaves the reporter in anxious, silent anticipation, and that's no good for anyone, especially because maintainers are busy and often don't come back to these things. So instead, we try to remedy it by always making forward progress when we touch a ticket. If you don't know, say you don't know. If you have a question, you need to research something, tell the reporter. And close a ticket if you think it could be closed. Because there's nothing worse than having a ticket that's open and both of you are like, well, do I need to do anything else? I'm happy. and having it be that way for 2 weeks before anyone actually closes it. Let's not do that. Just have a nice conversation with your reporter or your maintainer saying that you're closing it, and if you're mistaken, you can reopen it again. Similarly, there's some people who like to go find the oldest ticket that is remotely relevant to the thing that's wrong for them and say, me too. And while that's nice that they searched, it doesn't usually reflect the needs that they have. So we use lockbot to make sure that all of our oldest issues get closed, and people who have new issues create new issues. This makes sure that the conversations are fresh and that we're talking to the right people. So beyond merely talking about the issues in your cookbooks, we also need to talk about the maintainers, the people who are working on your cookbooks as well. We are a bit unusual because we have a bunch of people coming in and out of the organization contributing to it. But in almost every organization I've seen people ask, who owns this? Who do I need to talk about this bug? How do I get this thing merged? Why is this not working? It seems reasonable. What am I doing wrong? The way that we resolve that is by automation. We use Terraform to manage our GitHub org, so that way people who want to join just submit a pull request. And that allows us to codify this literally in code. And for each individual repo, we specify where you can go for help in a .github/CODEOWNERS file that tells you the group of people that know the most about this and should be able to help you with a PR if that's what you need review with. So beyond that, we happen to have a somewhat different set of pain points than some companies. We need money sometimes, just occasionally, very infrequently. I'm sure none of you have this problem, but sometimes we need our build server to be paid for so we can have capacity, or we need stickers, mostly stickers. But in order to do that, we would need to have a taxable entity, which is terrible, or we can use OpenCollective, which allows us to have a open finances, lets people easily donate to them, and lets you see exactly where your money is going if you're donating to it. If you belong to any open source or community organizations, I strongly encourage you to look at them. And another problem that's sort of unique to us is that we've talked about a number of things that require a bit of responsibility. We have a code of conduct, we have a license, we have a domain name that needs to be renewed, we have that OpenCollective, basically bank account, that can disperse funds. And there have to be people who are responsible for this. And we can't just let everyone take care of it. So we have a board. And for the next week, we're going to be having nominations for members of the board. If you can join our Slack channel and let us know anyone you think should be on the board, we're strongly encouraging you to talk about maintainers and people who are otherwise active in the community. But after a week of nominations, we're going to have a week where you're able to vote and everyone is able to vote. So please come join our Slack channel and help us figure out who's going to be responsible. There's not much power involved, it's mostly responsibility. So I can understand if you don't want to volunteer. So what have we talked about today? So we've talked about a whole bunch of pain points around getting new users to use your stuff, making sure that they have good interfaces to engage with your systems, some patterns for implementing those changes, a bunch of testing stuff, and some social patterns that have worked really well for us. But I would absolutely love it if you would go check out our work in Supermarket, and if you find any issues, file those issues in GitHub, talk with us on Slack, support us on OpenCollective, vote for board members in 2019, and otherwise just read this slide. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for sitting with me. That's everything I've got time to talk about. Do you guys have anything you want to talk about? Man. Ask again.
Yeah. So say there's a cookbook on the supermarket that seems like it hasn't been updated in a while, and we think it needs to have. We'd like maybe to have the sous chefs take a look at it. What's the process for going through and doing that?
Thank you. I will pay you for lobbing me that softball in a minute. So the most important thing that we care about is getting unmaintained cookbooks to not be unmaintained, which is also to say that getting them to be maintained. We have a handful of processes depending on how hard that maintainer is to get a hold of. That can be as simple as poking them saying, hey, mind if we help? To doing a hard fork, changing the name, and making sure that it's really clear to everyone around the existing cookbook that they can get support over with us. We've done both of all of those things and stuff in between. If you have a cookbook like that, you can either go into the Chef Slack and talk to us about it, or we have a repo in our GitHub org called Meta, and that's a good place to file that kind of a ticket.
So thinking about how someone comes to find themselves writing a cookbook to solve a problem, they say, hey, I'm going to go through the effort of opening a supermarket account, I'm going to stick it in there, but I'm done, right? It solved my problem, I'm finished, I don't need to update it anymore. How often do you find yourself actually getting back in touch with that original cookbook creator and taking ownership and them saying, you know, I have no more interest in this, here you can have it?
So ultimately that comes down to demand. If we find somebody who says, hey, do you know how to get, do you have a solution to this kind of an application problem? Because I've been using this cookbook and it was great, but it doesn't support Ubuntu 14.32, whatever. It doesn't support my platform and I need it to just have this one feature. We will often go through the headache of trying to contact that person, but as we've grown, we've gained more of the applications that people care about. So those things are less common. Yeah, we actually get people trying to hand us off cookbooks that they don't want to maintain a lot more these days. So.
You talked about shared files, like a common common repo, so to speak. We've thought about this before, but let's say you wanted to have a common chef ignore file, right? That's probably easy. You could probably have that stored in its own repo and then maybe deploy it during the build. But something like a kitchen YAML, or maybe a spec helper or something like that. If you want developers to run tests locally, or if they want to be able to run them locally and also via the build system, how do you solve centralizing these common files and sort of standardizing files across multiple cookbooks?
Badly. So we have gone back and forth about this a number of times. And at the moment, we don't have a fully automated way of standardizing these files. At the moment, we're manually syncing all of these things. But if you look at Vox Populi, they use a tool to synchronize all of their modules. If you look at linuxserver.io, they do extensive templating, kind of terrifying templating, that has a custom Jenkins builder that touches all of their packages all the time. And we're leaning more towards the approach that Vox Populi does, where it's just a script that gets run and syncs files. But we've also looked at things like Cookie Cutter. So Cookie Cutter is a Python project that uses a templating language and a JSON file that it can pull from, and a directory full of file templates, and you run it against a project, and it will populate all of those things. That's really experience we want to go with. The only reason we haven't gone with cookie cutter right now is because it's written in Python and the templating language is Jinja, and that's just not tools that our users use that much. We're talking about a solution. It's a thing we would like to build real soon.
Cool, thanks. I have another question.
I believe you. Go ahead.
Testing on multiple versions of Chef Client in Kitchen.
Yep.
Can you share some implementation details about that?
That is not in my RAM right now. We have, so I mentioned that we use Circle CI, and we have what's called an orb to manage our common configuration. So if you go to GitHub, Sous Chefs, orbs, there's a kitchen directory that has that experience. It should walk you through how we maintain that. And also what supporting a bunch of different platforms looks like. The short answer is we make sure we have different runs, different jobs for each of these things. We don't try and do it all in one big job. Trying to get error messages out of these things is painful enough as it is. If we can get a bunch of reds and greens, that's more valuable to us. So,
Thanks.
any other questions? Erin.
Louder than I thought that would be. So to switch gears a little bit and talk for a second possibly about pull requests. For you guys, when you look at sort of the public putting in pull requests, to what level of sort of specificity will you or will you not potentially accept them? If you had to, just an example, crack open the updater because you had one file in the center in your organization that had to be moved and you had to rewrite and stick in a bunch of PowerShell code to get that to run. Is that something things like that where you have to really had to break far into the cookbook, community cookbooks, is that too specific for pull requests? Is that something you guys will generally not accept, or
So
I just don't know?
Here's the bright line that we like to use. Is there someone else who will use this feature? If there is, and it's just not gotten merged because it's hard to implement, then we will absolutely take it. If it's adding no complexity and it adds a feature, we'll probably take it. If it adds a bunch of complexity and no one else is going to use it, we'll probably encourage you to use a fork for a while and tell us if you're really happy with it, and maybe come back 6 months later and tell us about it again. That being said, very often there's not that many maintainers for cookbooks. So if it's a thing that you're passionate about and it's important to your business, you can probably just become a maintainer and merge it yourself. We're not going to stop you. That's a lot of what it comes down to. Now, your specific use case, I know sure that was totally hypothetical and not related to your actual needs at all.
Never.
But yeah, we would definitely be interested in talking about that, because the updater can have weird requirements. It is involved in deep parts of your infrastructure and making it flexible, especially if we can do it in a way that doesn't impose your logic on everyone else. That would be very interesting to us. So, yeah.
So my question is kind of a follow-up to that one. When we talk about picking cookbooks to put into the Sous Chef pot, what's the criteria, and then how do you have a cadence for when you do releases? Do you have a plan for how much you want to maintain these cookbooks?
Yes. So we release. I'm going to start from the end. Our cadence is as it comes. We release as soon as there's a fix. There's no reason to wait on things. So sometimes you will get a bunch of different releases in 1 week because some new member has just joined and they submitted a pull request, and we merged it and released it, and they submitted another pull request because they hit some other bug at work, and so on. That's often how it happens. And in terms of what's our standard for accepting things, it's pretty similar to the same answer I said earlier. Is there another person who will use this thing? There's only a slightly higher bar. Will someone maintain it? If you're just trying to offload your trash onto us, we might notice. It's happened before that we noticed. Sometimes we don't. But we want these things to be healthy. The whole point of it is for them to be healthy. But that being said, if they're in our garbage pile, at least someone can get them out of our garbage pile. Whereas if they're in your garbage pile, they may be stuck there. So sometimes it's worth it for us to just take it and stick it in our boneyard. That may be the case. But to reiterate, is there another user? Is someone willing to maintain it? That's really all we care about. Anyone else got questions?
Kind of a time, but you want to go?
Looks like about it. Well, thank you guys so much. See you on the internet.